shoes, world on my shoulder, heart full of blues. I'm in the dirt, down in the dirt. I've been a real bad boy on the town all night. Starting to calm down with the morning light. I'm in the dirt, down in the dirt. Been real bad. I've been a real bad boy on the town all night. Starting to shoot.